Hey everyone, I would just like to make a few comments about our module this week, which I've titled African Philosophy and Art, Literature and Other Arts, and the Creative Space in Connection with Philosophy. So, unwieldy title. But it's generally around questions of artistic production, and I mean that in quite a broad sense. And you're going to see that broad sense reflected, I think, throughout this module. I have a conversation, one of the African philosophy conversations. This time it's with two people, Dr. Jean Marie Jackson and Dr. Omedio Chang, and they are both literary people trained in literary production and literary analysis in African contexts. And so our conversation really is about the intersection of philosophy and literature. And I really don't want to make this philosophy of literature. That's a kind of a sub-area of philosophy. Some of you might be familiar with it, and it reflects on how literature accomplishes its tasks. What counts as literature and what doesn't count as literature. So the classic kind of philosophical questions about metaphysics and epistemology and so forth. The ethical effects of literature, so a lot of questions around that come up in philosophy of literature, and I'm actually much more interested in the intersection between what philosophers do and what creative people do in general. So as I say, the conversation is about literature, but other elements of this module focus on other things, including visual art, music a little bit. I mean, that's implied by some of the stuff on negritude, and yes, we're back on negritude again. And so, what I hope that you take from this is, I guess a different kind of orientation towards how philosophy encounters the world. Often within Western philosophy, if you're familiar at all with it, you will think of it in terms, as we've talked before about, sets of arguments for things, long form arguments where somebody is defending a position or a proposition or analyzing a concept or something like that. And we think of philosophy as a kind of normative discipline in which, we're not only examining things, but we're arguing that a certain thing is the best approach to something or the concept to adopt or something like that. All of that's legitimate stuff. I mean, all of that's important in philosophy. But what I want to say in the context of African philosophy is that there's more going on than just that. Yes, there is that. And yes, we look for that within African philosophy. But we also look, I think, for other kinds of things. And part of it has to do with, the word I have often used is the wellspring of philosophy. And what I mean by wellspring is not just the origin of philosophy, not just the idea that philosophy begins at some point in history under a certain set of conditions. A lot of people have written about that question. Is it, why is it that philosophy begins in ancient Greece? Well, first off, does it really begin in ancient Greece? I mean, does that not, edit out all of Africa, all of Asia, all of, indigenous peoples everywhere, as even having philosophy at all? Well, of course it does. But the people who want to, investigate that, want to identify something in Greece, ancient Greece, that was particularly amenable for philosophy to do what it does. And sometimes those things involve things like democracy, especially in Athens. Sometimes they involve more creative sorts of things. So people might look at something like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey as examples of literary works that nevertheless also introduce us to philosophical kinds of questions. And if you tell the story about ancient Greece and the development of philosophy, you often begin with that kind of literary beginning point, and then you work your way up to someone like Plato or Aristotle, who actually had some very skeptical views on literature and on art in general. I mean, Plato famously was not a fan of literary production, especially. He thought that it was, 3 times removed from truth. So truth was, looking directly at something, and then literature was telling a story about a story about a story. In other words, it was just a pale reflection of truth. So he was skeptical about dramatic arts, tragedy, and things like that. So that's the story we tell in Greece. Now, is that story the story we want to tell elsewhere, especially Africa? I think not. I think there's a different conversation to be had in Africa than that very familiar Western story. And some of it revolves around artistic production. So this idea of the wellspring is not just the origin at a point in time, but it is the thing which continually feeds the production of philosophy, right? So, like a well continually gives you water, at least if the well is a live well. And so we could look to, a number of people have looked to non-philosophical cultural content as the origin or as the beginning point of philosophy. A guy named Theophilus Okere, a Nigerian philosopher, thought about that when he thought about what he called hermeneutic philosophy, historical hermeneutic philosophy, he called it. And what he had in mind was the idea that philosophy begins in non-philosophy. And what he meant by that was cultural content, religion, things like that. Now, a lot of other people, and that includes those interested in negritude, have thought instead that philosophy has to come from the reflection on the lived conditions of people in their worlds. And so that immediately puts it in a kind of place, right? The culture is not universal. It's specific to languages, to places, to peoples, to, all sorts of different things, genders, political or economic structures. There are a lot of different ways of thinking about culture. And, so one way we could think about culture is in terms of its intellectual production, and that often can come through artistic production, right? And so in Africa, we can look, traditionally in the arts, we're going to have to talk about what the status of the arts are in Africa compared to how we think about the arts in the West. But, we can think about music, dance, we can think about visual production, we can think about ritual objects that have, we might call it decorative content, but that might be very meaningful decorative content. Symbols of various sorts, as well as theatrical productions, all sorts of things, everything, even architecture. We could think about all of these things as having a kind of, communicating a way of living together and a set of things that matter, a set of values. And then philosophy taking those things, African philosophy taking those things out of African culture and asking, so what exactly is it that we're talking about here? What are these values? Will they hold up? Will they stand up? Where do they come from? Are there better values? Are we deviating from values that we claim to hold, but really, in the way that we live, it's not evident that we actually do hold them? So lots of different questions that put philosophy at the edge of other disciplines. And for me, at least, that's where philosophy gets to be most interesting, right? It's interesting to kind of follow a train of thought, an argument that philosophers have dealt with since time immemorial. I think it's just as interesting to look at the philosophical content that emerges when philosophy bumps up against other disciplines and against forms of life in the world. For me, that's one of the reasons why African philosophy is so exciting. And so, we've got a couple of readings in this module. One of them is this reading by Leopold Sédar Senghor. We've seen a fair bit of him throughout this term. I keep going back to Senghor in part because I think he so clearly and so well articulates some of the kinds of questions that I think are really central to philosophical reflection. And whether you actually agree with the answers he comes to or not, I think he at least asks the questions very well. And so in this essay, this is an essay that was originally a lecture, and it was a lecture, I think, at Oxford or somewhere like that, so to an Anglophone audience. And so he wants to think about aesthetics specifically and what place it has within African culture, but also implicitly African philosophy. And it's places like this where he really lays out a theory of negritude, which is based in notions of rhythm, repetition, aesthetic notions, emotional notions, responses to things like music, and what comes with that, which is a kind of communal or shared response. So it's not just locking yourself up in a room and listening to something and enjoying it. It's doing these things together. That is what really matters, and that's what he's arguing for here. And so I'd like you to read this article. This is something written in mid 20th century, and so it's a while back, and we already know by this point that negritude had a very mixed reception among African philosophers and among others as well. And so it's worth asking, are there fair criticisms of this, and is Senghor really trying to give us a picture of a form of life that enables philosophy to have something to reflect on, and a form of life that, while perhaps not absent in the rest of the world, is at least emphasized within an African context in ways that it often isn't. And of course, Senghor is mostly, contrasting Africa and Europe, right? So that's negritude always has that shadow of colonialism and that shadow of European engagement. So there's that article. There is also, and so we're also looking at this article by Ajuma Wingo called The Many-Layered Aesthetics of African Art. And I included this essay in part because I like the way he thinks about how to think about African art. One of the issues, if we're thinking about, how we approach art as philosophers, I mean, it's very difficult for those of us trained in the West to shake some of the discourse of Western thought. It's very difficult to enter into African modes of thinking about really anything, but certainly art. And here's one example of that. In the West, especially today, we are the heirs of someone like Immanuel Kant and others who think about art very much in terms of work that's done for its own sake. I mean, that was part of Kant's point when he was thinking about the difference between art and, as it were, decoration or craft work or things of that nature. And so that kind of hard and fast dividing line allowed someone like Kant to think about the form of things, focus on the form of things as that was the real value of art, to think not so much about the materials but about the questions that art evoked and what it reached towards. And we can even see this as far back as Plato, where material things reach for the form of the good or the form of beauty or something of that nature. And so that's very much kind of baked into the discourse around philosophy of art in the West, and that's something I think we have to set to the side, if we're going to think about how to think about art in Africa. And it should be said, often the same thing applies to thinking about art in traditional communities around the world, even in the traditional West, because often the border between what we might consider art and what we might consider decorative, useful objects is a very fuzzy, very gray border. And so, we have to look elsewhere to think about how art functions. And I think Wingo actually does a really nice job of getting us to think about that question in particular. Like, what is it that we're analyzing? Well, we're analyzing the aesthetics. And by aesthetics, I mean the kind of lived encounter, the felt encounter that we have with art, or that Africans have with art, right? So, this is another example, I guess, of decolonizing the mind, getting rid of a set of assumptions that we might bring to art, that assumes that the only things that can properly be called art are things that might show up in a gallery or in a museum, where the value is either intrinsic to them or, in terms of an art market, so exchange value, but not in terms of use, right? Not in terms of how it was used or might be used or its significance to a community or something like that. Now, obviously, that discourse has changed in the West as well. I mean, a lot of times, some very profound and interesting art has been done by focusing on materials, by focusing on, objects that otherwise have uses. Some of the, revolutions in 20th century art have been to push back against that kind of formalism of art. But, that whole storyline that we tell in Western art really in some ways has to be set to the side when we think about how we encounter art philosophically in an African context. So I think Wingo helps us with that. So the other parts of the module, I have some history of philosophy without any gaps episodes for you to listen to, and they're all around negritude. I could have had you listen to these earlier in the course, but I think now is a good time to think about how negritude integrates with questions of art. It's obviously more than that, right? It's politics as well, and it's ethics as well, and all sorts of other things. And so we've got that. We've got the conversation I already mentioned with Drs. Jackson and Ocheng. And then in the rest of the module, what I've got, the main part of it is really two longer videos, and I'm asking you to watch one or the other, but you can obviously watch both if you want, but I'm asking you to focus on one or the other, and there's going to be questions within the discussion area about these. One of them is called the Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto, and it's really an attempt to think through what an Afrofuturism looks like that in some ways pushes back against the kind of high concept Afrofuturisms that we saw some of in the last module. So pushing back against, Sun Ra and, George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic and, a lot of things that get understood in the kind of public mind as Afrofuturist. This is really, as the title suggests, the mundane. So in other words, the lived experience of Africans to think through what does an Afrofuturism look like under those conditions. So there's a lot of interesting, useful interviews in this one. I think it's a really pretty interesting video, and it gets at what I think of as a kind of phenomenology, which we haven't talked about much directly, but phenomenology is attention to the phenomena and the question of how we as people within the world have the experience of that world and where that comes from, what it means. And there's obviously, we have whole courses on phenomenology here at UCF. I think this is a little bit of a toe in the water of what that might look like in an African context. The other video that you could choose to look at is on a single artist, Lala Saidi, and she is a Moroccan artist who I think does some really wonderful work on thinking about how elements of Islamic visuality and African visuality can be used to kind of interrogate the status of women and the position of women within Moroccan culture and within world culture. I think her work is absolutely amazing. And so this is really a lecture by her with lots of visuals to kind of think through what that might be like. And so again, neither of these videos are directly on philosophy, right? There's nowhere that they're saying, and here's where the philosophy is in thinking about this. But if you take what I said earlier, which is I'm looking for that space between philosophy and other disciplines, in this case aesthetic disciplines, creative production and things like that. I think both of these videos do that. I think both of them actually get us to that point of thinking about how can we have conceptual discussion in the space of creative production, right? So not that the creative production is just an illustration of philosophical ideas or something like that. It's not that we can, say, oh, look, here's this painting and it tells us something about universals, or it tells us something about race, or it tells us something about ethics or whatever. I mean, it may do that, in some way or other, but I think more importantly, it opens up a space to talk about some ambiguities, in concepts that I think are actually very valuable for philosophers to think about. Philosophers tend to try and clarify things, and I think it's a very good impulse for us to clarify things. But not everything can be easily clarified, and especially when we come to human experience, and especially experience outside of the bounds of, the kind of dominant discourse within philosophy, I think there's a lot to explore there. And so I think these two videos kind of get us at least part way there. And so we're going to kind of play with those a little bit. So that's this week's module. I think it's a really fun stuff. I mean, there's lots of great visuals and lots of really interesting stuff. I could have put a lot of other stuff in front of you, to look at. If you've taken my African Humanities course, you know that we spent several weeks on visuality, and weeks on literature, and weeks on music, and all sorts of other things. We could have just gone into a ton of actual production, but this is a philosophy course, and so I really want to think about how philosophers can engage this kind of work, and how it cannot be reducible, or we can resist it being reducible to the discourses within a Western context of how we ought to think about art. So that's the game for this week, and so I hope you have fun with this, and I look forward to the discussion area. Thanks a lot.